Dr. Mark Changizi here with your Science Moment. I'm going to talk today about what do we know about knowledge? What do we know about historical knowledge and even scientific knowledge? And I want to suggest that you should doubt yourself more than you do, and that COVID hysteria, gave us a really great example. So let's just walk this through. For those of you who were on sort of team anti-lockdown and sort of saw from the beginning, or at least early on, the deeply irrational notion that the interventions would work, that civil liberties violations were ethical, that COVID was a disproportionately dangerous, altogether novel virus. None of these things were true. None of these things were even sensible on their face, right? But most of the world believed it, right? Most of the world continued to believe it. Most of the world agitated for zero COVID. Most of the world would stop you on the street and ask you, why aren't you wearing a mask? Or why aren't you wearing a mask in the right place, indoors, at restaurants, and so forth, right? They were enforcing it on the street. No one asked them to, but they did anyway, right? So this new narrative occurred, and it happened about mid-March, and much of the world acquired this new narrative that there are these pandemics, they can happen, and COVID was disproportionately novel, altogether, novel, disproportionately dangerous. We ought to do all these interventions, all these things totally work, blah, 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 right? All of this acquired within weeks or months. And they had the advantage of us screaming in their ear, saying, no, none of this makes sense. Here's all these arguments. None of this makes sense, right? We were there in their ear from various angles saying this is irrational. All right. But it didn't help, right? This narrative still got added, these pieces of irrational knowledge got added to the narrative, and they're still there today. Most people still believe that if there was another pandemic, if it were to occur, that we ought to do all of those things because lockdowns proved themselves, masks proved themselves. Most people still believe it's ethical if there's an emergency to balance civil liberties with these utilitarian concerns and violate civil liberties en masse, violate bodily autonomy, informed consent, violate free speech. It's okay for the federal government to stop misinformation because pandemic, right? All of these things are still part of the narrative, despite all of my efforts and many of your efforts. Right? So now imagine someone coming to the game after the fact. They didn't have the advantage like us of watching it occur. They're only coming after the fact and seeing the narrative later, right? They didn't really hear us because we're not really in the historical records that are going to be describing the mainstream historical point of view for what happened. What do you expect them to believe? Well, they're going to think that a pandemic came, it was disproportionately dangerous, altogether novel, all these interventions, which were the rational thing to do, and there's hundreds and hundreds of papers that show that masks work, blah, blah, blah. And what are you going to expect them to suddenly figure it out all themselves after the fact when they aren't able to watch it in real time? No, they're going to believe the narrative, the mainstream narrative, just like those that watched it happen believe it. And they have fewer resources in some ways than did we who were watching the entire time. So you ask yourself then, well, how many other things do we believe? Historical facts, facts about science. How many of these things just got added to the narrative irrationally, right? Now, free expression over time tends to, when it's working and it's not ill, add to the narrative things that tend to be true, and hopefully over time wipe away the ones that aren't true and replace them with the truth. But the history of all the knowledge that we have and the historical events and so forth isn't always doing it in a non-ill, in a healthy manner. So the social narrative is packed with falsehoods. Right? And they're just what we take to believe, take as true walking in the door. Now, as a scientist, our job as a scientist is to figure out which of, if there's, let's say, 100 interesting, supposedly established mainstream hypotheses that have consensus, which of these, which 5%, let's suppose 95% tend to be true and somewhat true, but there's 5%, and I'm making up these numbers, I have no idea the actual numbers, 5% are completely hogwash. It's probably 50% are complete hogwash. 20% have some grain of truth and so forth. But there's some fraction of them that are complete hogwash, and nobody described it. None of your professors, your advisor almost certainly didn't describe them as hogwash. They were backed up by years and decades of literature thousands of papers and hundreds of experiments backed them up by really great people that you look up to. Men and women that that are 20 years, 50 years, 100 years older than you, and you're like, wow, these are great. I want to be like them someday. But these are the folks that were probably wrong, because the consensus of that particular idea may have gotten formed for no good reason through groupthink, minor hysteria-like processes. And I found out in my own research all the time that there's no good. In fact, some of these ideas not only are wrong, they're not even wrong. They don't even make sense as hypotheses that could logically even explain that kind of data. They're not even empirically wrong, right? There's a lot of these cases, like the standard theories about perceptual illusions weren't even wrong, right? So I spent 20 years ago or something just arguing conceptually, like it doesn't even make sense on its own face. It's just not even wrong, right? Science is filled with these things, and that's sort of the fun of it, trying to figure out which of the consensus things, because they're always sort of deemed as consensus for the most part, which are in fact wrong and were formed through ill processes. And I never really quite thought about it this way. Having watched a gigantic one that swept through much of the world, it's very different than typically science, which is a relatively small number of folks involved, where things can go wrong actually more quickly because there's just a small number of professors. And so as soon as a sufficient number of them say, yeah, that's probably right, it gets added to sufficiently many textbooks, it's just taken as consensus. And that's a kind of illness, right? It's a much bigger illness when you can get a really terrible ideas to spread worldwide. And this is why that's more deserving of the word mass hysteria. So I just wanted, this is more of a reflection moment. And I think it should help make you reflect upon all of the things that you think that you know, but whether it's historical or scientific or just general wisdom in life, many of these things were formed and added to the narrative in invalid ways, so to speak. And someday it'll correct itself, but it could be many, many hundreds of years before it does. And that was your science moment.